The galaxy had seen weapons beyond imagination. Stars shattered, worlds burned, entire civilizations erased in seconds. Yet the whispers in the dark spoke of something older, something hidden away, something that made even the most ruthless empires shiver when its name was mentioned. It wasn't forged from steel, nor powered by suns, nor built by machines. The weapon was not a thing. The weapon was a people. The weapon was humanity. No one in the Great Councils believed it at first. Humans were supposed to be extinct, nothing more than a lost species buried under forgotten wars. To most, they were a myth, a cautionary tale told to keep arrogant commanders from underestimating smaller enemies. But to those who had studied the old archives, the warnings were real. There were records of battles where entire fleets disappeared, not because they were outgunned, but because they had encountered humans. It wasn't their ships that made them dangerous, nor their numbers, but something else. Something impossible to copy, something no empire could replicate. I first heard the story on the edge of a failing colony, a place where rust bled into metal and people barely clung to survival. It was the kind of place where rumors traveled faster than ships, and those rumors spoke of the return of humanity. They said fragments of their kind still lived, scattered, hidden in the ruins of forgotten stations. They said if you found them, you wouldn't find allies, you'd find a weapon that could turn the tide of any war. At first, I didn't want to believe. How could one broken species be more terrifying than the fleets of the conquerors who ruled the stars? But there was something in the way people spoke their name, with fear and awe blended into one, that made me listen. They weren't described as saviors. They weren't described as monsters either. They were something in between, unpredictable and unstoppable. The mission that brought us to this point was simple, at least on paper. We were tasked to find the remnants of this species, to confirm or deny the truth of the old warnings. But simple never meant safe. Every step into forgotten sectors felt like stepping deeper into the grave. Abandoned stations drifted in silence, with scars of battles still etched into their walls. Ships left to rot looked as though something had torn through them from the inside. And always there were signs, clues, that someone had been there before us. Someone watching. The further we traveled, the heavier the silence became. The crew stopped joking. Even the sound of boots against metal seemed too loud, like it might draw something out of the shadows. I started to notice the smallest details. Lights flickering where no power should exist, doors unlocked that should have been sealed for centuries, the faint echo of footsteps when none of us were moving. And then one night we heard it. A voice. Not over comms, not from the ship systems, but echoing down the corridor of a derelict station we were searching. A human voice. It was raw, steady, filled with something I couldn't name. It wasn't mechanical, not a trick of static. It was alive. We followed it deeper, though every instinct told me to turn back. The air was stale, heavy with dust, yet the deeper we went the more recent everything felt. Tools left behind. Food wrappers. A half-burned candle still standing upright. Someone had been here not long ago. Someone human. That's when I began to understand what made them dangerous. Not their weapons. Not their ships. It was their refusal to break, their ability to turn ruin into survival. Where any other species would give up, they adapted. Where others would fall to despair, they hardened. They carried something inside them that couldn't be stolen or destroyed. But the galaxy hadn't forgotten them for no reason. There was a reason they had been buried, silenced, erased from history. A reason no one wanted them found again. And as we moved through that station, I could feel why. Every shadow felt alive. Every step forward felt like trespassing into something that should have stayed lost. And when we reached the heart of the station, we saw it. A figure standing alone in the dim light, watching us with eyes that carried a weight no soldier could match. Their presence filled the room like a storm waiting to break. They didn't reach for a weapon. They didn't need to. Just standing there, they radiated the kind of power you couldn't measure with technology. A power born from loss, from resilience, from unyielding will. And in that moment, I knew the stories were true. Humanity had not died. Humanity had become something more. And if they chose to rise again, they wouldn't just fight. They would change the war itself. But before we could speak, before we could even take a step closer, the lights went out. The entire station plunged into darkness. The sound of machinery roared back to life, doors locking behind us, systems sparking awake as though the station itself had been waiting for this moment. A voice echoed through the black, not just from the figure, but from every speaker, every wall, every wire. Calm, sharp, carrying the promise of both hope and destruction. You were sent to find a weapon. Congratulations. You found one. The floor shook beneath our feet as something deep in the station powered on, and I realized this was not just about finding humanity. This was about what they had been preparing for all this time. And in that instant, fear and awe collided inside me. Because I knew we had uncovered something the galaxy had spent centuries trying to bury. Something that should never have been woken. Something human. The air turned heavy, the silence unbearable as the figures stepped forward. Their footsteps echoed like the beating of war drums. The glow of red emergency lights lit their face in fragments, and the shadows swallowed the rest. And then, just as they opened their mouth to speak again, the station screamed with alarms. Something was coming. Something none of us were ready for. That was when I finally understood what the whispers meant. Humanity wasn't the weapon. Humanity was the trigger. And someone had just pulled it. The silence of the alien vessel pressed in on the crew as they waited for answers that never came. The human who had spoken. His voice carried not only through the translator but seemed to echo in the very metal of the chamber, had left behind an unease that words could not erase. Every alien eye remained fixed on him, waiting for some clarification, some proof that what they just heard was nothing more than a misinterpretation. But the human gave none. He only stood there, his hands scarred, his posture worn but steady, his breathing calm as if he had spoken nothing remarkable at all. The mission had been simple. Or at least it was supposed to be. They had been dispatched to the ruins of an abandoned outpost on the edge of forgotten space, searching for an ancient weapon, something rumored to have been left behind in a war so old that most records had turned to dust. The legend spoke of a power that could end entire civilizations with a single command, a weapon forged in a time before their kind even understood what war truly meant. They had been ready to find machinery, maybe forbidden technology locked behind seals of metal and fire. Instead they had found this. A single human. And he had said, with unsettling certainty, "I am the weapon." The thought reverberated inside their minds. How could a fragile being like him be what they were sent to retrieve? His body bore the marks of struggle, cuts, burns, healed fractures that told of pain endured, but there was no machine, no gleaming engine of war behind him. Just a man, alive in the silence of a tomb that should have been long empty. The commander of the alien crew struggled to steady her voice as she demanded an explanation. What do you mean by that? You were left here to die. You are not the weapon. You cannot be. But even she didn't believe her own words, not entirely. The legends hadn't said what form the weapon would take. Only that it was unstoppable. The human tilted his head, studying them with eyes that held no fear. His silence was heavier than any weapon. For the crew, it was as if those eyes could see through every layer of armor, every defense they carried, stripping them down to the vulnerable truth of who they were. That was what unsettled them most, not his words but the quiet confidence that followed them. Whispers passed among the crew. Some argued that he was nothing more than a survivor, a relic of another age clinging desperately to life. Others muttered that the stories must have been exaggerated, that their superiors had sent them chasing after myths. And yet, none could ignore the strange hum that seemed to radiate from the chamber itself, a subtle vibration that quickened when the human moved. He didn't strike. He didn't raise a weapon. But something about his very presence carried weight. The younger members of the crew began to ask questions. How had he survived here, alone, in the ruins of a world swallowed by time? What had he eaten, what had he endured, what had he become? His silence offered no easy answers, but his scars spoke louder than words. They were not the marks of someone broken, they were the marks of someone who had refused to be broken. And that terrified them. Because if this was the weapon their legends spoke of, then perhaps it was never about firepower or machines. Perhaps the weapon was not something you carried in your hands, but something carried inside the heart, something unyielding, something no war could burn away. The commander clenched her fists as a sick realization began to crawl through her mind. They had been sent not to claim the weapon but to awaken it, to test whether the old stories were true. And if that was the case, then they had already failed because the human was awake and he was watching them. Still she tried to hold control. If you are what they say you are, then prove it. Show us. For the first time, the human moved with intent. He stepped forward, each sound of his boots striking the metal floor echoing like a drumbeat in the silence. The crew instinctively pulled back. Not because he had raised his fists, not because he had armed himself, but because of the certainty in his stride. He looked like someone who had already walked through fire and survived. Someone who had nothing left to fear. He stopped just short of the commander and said in a low voice that carried like thunder, "Proof is survival. Proof is endurance. Proof is still standing when everything else is ash." Those words unsettled the crew more than any display of violence could have. Because deep down they knew he was right. A weapon like this didn't need to be shown. It only needed to exist. And as the chamber trembled with a faint rumble, as if the ruin itself was responding to his words, the crew realized this mission was no longer about discovery. It was about survival. They had awakened something their leaders didn't truly understand, and now they stood inches away from it. One of the younger crew members whispered a question that hung heavy in the stale air. What happens now? The human didn't answer immediately. He turned his gaze toward the shadows of the chamber, where forgotten machines lay dormant and broken. For a moment, his expression softened, as though he remembered something long buried. Then slowly he looked back at them and said, "That depends on why you came here." The tension in the air thickened. Because none of them could answer with certainty. They had been sent here for power, for control, for a weapon to turn against their enemies. But now, standing in front of a living legend, they were no longer sure if they were the masters, or the prey. The silence stretched on, unbearable, each second dragging like an eternity. The commander opened her mouth, but no words came. The crew shifted uneasily, hands tightening on their gear, eyes darting nervously between one another. And in that stillness the human smiled, a small, tired smile that carried no warmth. "You're afraid," he said softly. "Good. That means you understand." Then the lights of the chamber flickered, the hum deepened, and somewhere in the distance ancient machinery stirred awake, groaning like the bones of a giant long dead. The ground shuddered beneath their feet, dust falling from the ceiling. The ruins were responding. And in that moment, as the crew struggled to hold their balance, it became clear that this was only the beginning. The weapon was not just the man. The weapon was everything that had made him, everything that still lingered in the shadows of this forgotten place. What terrified them most was not what he had already survived, but what he was about to unleash. And as the walls trembled with the weight of awakening, the crew realized they had crossed a line they could never retreat from. The human raised his eyes, calm, steady, unwavering, and whispered words that froze their blood. "You wanted a weapon. Now you'll see what humanity truly is." The chamber shook harder, the air thick with dust and tension, and the crew could only stare as the legend they had sought began to reveal itself, one heartbeat at a time. Would they live to understand it? Or would they be swallowed whole by the very power they came to claim? The answer hung just out of reach, waiting in the echoes of the ruins. The chamber trembled as if the walls themselves were holding back something that did not want to be caged. Dust rained from the cracks in the stone, and the ancient lights lining the ceiling flickered weakly, as though warning them of what was about to happen. No one spoke, no one dared to. The air felt heavy, charged with a weight that pressed against their chests, making every breath harder than the last. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was expectation, like the seconds before a storm split the sky open. The soldiers shifted uneasily, their armor clinking softly in the silence. They had been trained to stand against armies, to fight until the last man, but none of that mattered here. This wasn't a battlefield where they could draw weapons and measure skill against an enemy. This was something else. Something older, larger, far beyond their understanding. And standing in the center of that immense chamber was the thing they had come to see, the weapon that the galaxy whispered about but no one believed truly existed. It wasn't a machine, not like the others they had uncovered in their search. It wasn't dormant metal waiting to be reactivated. It wasn't an engine of war designed by alien hands. It was human. Or at least it had the shape of one. A figure, tall, lean, and utterly still, encased in layers of rusted armor that seemed fused into its very body. For a moment it looked like a statue left behind by some long-forgotten empire. But the longer they stared, the more wrong it felt. Statues didn't breathe. Statues didn't radiate presence. The captain clenched his fists, trying to steady his nerves, though even his voice trembled when he whispered, "This is what they feared. This is what they locked away." And the thought settled over them like a dark blanket. The galaxy had not simply forgotten humanity, they had buried it, sealed it away. Not because humanity was weak but because they were too strong. The stories of humans as the ultimate weapon were not exaggerations. They were warnings. And now, after centuries of silence, that warning was standing before them again. The air grew colder. The faint sound of breathing, slow, measured, unnatural, echoed across the chamber. One of the soldiers stepped back, his boots scraping against the floor. That small sound rang louder than a gunshot, and the figure's head tilted, almost imperceptibly, but enough to freeze everyone in place. Its eyes were closed, yet there was no question it knew they were there. They had come seeking power. Now they weren't sure if they had found salvation or doom. The chamber doors groaned as if straining to stay shut against the weight of time, and somewhere deep in the stone walls came a rumble like distant thunder. The figure in the center shifted slightly, and a faint hiss of metal grinding against metal echoed through the chamber. Its eyelids twitched. And then, slowly they opened. The eyes were not machine-like. They were not glowing with alien light or filled with circuitry. They were unmistakably human. But they burned with something more. A fire that should not have survived the ages, a fury that belonged to a time when humanity had fought not just to live, but to dominate, to rise no matter how many empires tried to cage them. Those eyes fell upon the soldiers, and in that instant, they understood what every alien civilization in the galaxy had once feared. Humanity had never been defeated. They had been contained. The silence shattered when the ground beneath them cracked, spiderwebs of fractures spreading across the chamber floor. The figure straightened fully now, standing taller than they expected, and every joint of its armored body screamed with the sound of age, like rust tearing itself apart. The soldiers raised their weapons instinctively, but their captain snapped out a hand to stop them. Shooting at this thing felt like shooting at a mountain. It wouldn't matter. The figure took one step forward. The sound was deafening, like thunder rolling through the stone halls. Another step, and the ancient lights overhead flared, as if feeding on the energy pouring out of its presence. By the third step, every soldier's hands were trembling on their rifles. Some of them looked like they wanted to run. None of them did. The captain swallowed hard. "Identify yourself," he managed, though his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. The figure tilted its head. Then a voice, low, rough, carrying the weight of centuries, cut through the chamber. "I am what they feared you would find." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Each syllable carried power, enough to make the soldiers' stomachs twist. The captain tried to hold his ground, but his heart hammered in his chest. "We were told, you were a weapon." The figure's eyes narrowed. "Weapon." It stepped closer, and this time the ground shook violently. "No. I am war." The soldiers flinched. One of them muttered under his breath, "This is wrong. This should never have been released." But it was too late. The chamber was alive now, ancient mechanisms long dormant stirring to life. The walls hummed with energy, and symbols carved into the stone glowed faintly as though responding to the figure's awakening. Whatever had been holding it down was unraveling, and the galaxy outside had no idea what was about to be unleashed. The captain's throat was dry, but he forced the words out. "If you are war, then what happens now?" The figure turned its gaze fully upon him. And in that look the captain felt not just fear but something sharper, judgment. Outside, somewhere far above the chamber, a storm began to rage. The soldiers tightened their grip on their weapons, sweat dripping from their faces. The figure lifted a hand, fingers curling into a fist as if testing strength that had not been used in centuries. The air bent around it, the very space warping under its will. For the first time, the soldiers realized that this wasn't just about them or their mission, or the galaxy's curiosity. This was about what humanity truly was when stripped of restraint. And as the chamber shook harder, and the walls cracked as though the world itself could not contain the force building within, the soldiers understood the truth. The ultimate weapon wasn't what humanity had created. It was humanity itself. And now, it was awake. The silence after the broadcast was unbearable. Every soldier, every survivor, every officer in that control room had frozen as the alien voice repeated its claim. Humanity had not just been found, not just been catalogued, humanity had been built. The word lingered in the air like poison. Built. Not born. The weight of it pressed on their chests, heavier than the air of the failing ship they stood on. Questions they didn't dare speak clawed inside their minds. Who had made them? Why had they been scattered through the stars? And most importantly, what purpose had they been designed for? The alien fleet outside wasn't retreating anymore. They were moving again, methodical, as if they were waiting for humanity's response. Ships shifted in the dark void like predators circling prey. The enemy wasn't afraid, not yet, but there was hesitation in their movements, a strange caution. They knew something humanity didn't. And that uncertainty cut deeper than any weapon could. One of the soldiers gripped the railing, his knuckles white. "They're lying. They're just trying to break us." His voice was hoarse, but it trembled at the edges. No one answered him. Because deep down, in that place where reason didn't matter, they all feared it might be true. The captain's eyes narrowed at the tactical display. If it's a lie, then it means nothing. If it's the truth, he stopped, unable to finish. The words would make it real. Someone finally broke the silence. If we were made, then by who? And for what? The question spread through the room like fire. Eyes darted to one another, searching for reassurance, for denial, for anything that might make this nightmare easier to swallow. But no one had an answer. Then the lights flickered again. The alien signal hadn't ended. It pulsed through the broken systems of the ship like a heartbeat, leaking into the speakers, into the walls, into the air itself. A distorted voice hissed through the static. You were forged for war. The word struck like a blade. And in that moment, everyone felt it. The memories of every war humanity had fought, every desperate act of survival, every impossible victory that had defied the odds. What if it wasn't just resilience? What if it wasn't just human will? What if it was programming written into their very blood? The fleet outside shifted again. The alien ships were aligning, forming a perimeter around the crippled human vessel. Not an attack, something worse. They were waiting. Containing. As if they feared what might happen if they pushed too far. The captain clenched his fists. His voice was steel, but underneath it was something else. Fear, anger, maybe both. We've fought our wars on our terms. We've bled for every inch of ground, every breath of freedom. If they think they own us, he stopped, his voice catching. Then they've made their worst mistake. But before he could say more, alarms blared. A system deep in the ship came online, one that none of them had activated. The screen filled with unreadable symbols, alien yet hauntingly familiar. Then, slowly, lines of text in human language appeared. Protocol awakening, initiating. Every heart froze. The ship had never carried such a system. It wasn't theirs. And yet, it was embedded so deeply into the core systems it couldn't be erased. The soldiers exchanged glances, unease in their eyes. This wasn't just a broadcast anymore. This was something hidden, buried in the technology they thought they understood. Someone whispered, they weren't lying. The deck shook as the ship's weapon systems armed themselves, not by human command but by something older, something buried. The targeting arrays lit up, painting the alien fleet with markers no one had chosen. It was as if the ship itself had been waiting for this moment. The captain barked, cut it off. Shut it down now. But the engineers worked frantically, hands flying over controls, and nothing responded. The ship was awake and it wasn't listening. The alien fleet moved closer, and for the first time the humans could feel it, not aggression, not anger, but fear. The enemy wasn't pressing the attack. They were backing away, slowly, deliberately, as if they had triggered something they couldn't control. One soldier turned toward the captain, his face pale. They weren't trying to destroy us. They were trying to contain us. The truth sank like ice through the room. The enemy wasn't afraid of human ships. They weren't afraid of human weapons. They were afraid of what humanity was. The air grew heavy with tension. The ship's systems glowed with eerie light, panels humming with a rhythm that wasn't human. The message played again, clearer this time, echoing through every corridor. You were forged to end civilizations. You were forged to be the weapon of last resort. No one could breathe. The words weren't shouted, but they carried the weight of inevitability. And suddenly the humans realized the second twist of the knife. This wasn't just a revelation. It was a warning. If the ship continued to awaken, if the systems fully came online, they didn't know what would happen, but the aliens did. That was why they circled and waited, afraid to strike, afraid to run. They were trapped in their own hesitation, caught between the threat of extinction and the fear of awakening something worse. And at the center of it all were the humans, standing on a ship that was no longer theirs, watching as the line between their will and something older blurred. The captain's voice broke the silence. If this is what we are, then we need to decide now. Are we going to be the weapon they made us to be? Or something they never expected? But before an answer could be found, the deck groaned as the ship shifted course on its own, engines firing without command. The stars outside spun, the alien fleet scrambling to reposition. The humans braced themselves as the vessel accelerated toward the unknown, dragged by a force they couldn't control. And deep inside the ship, far below where any human hand had reached, something ancient stirred. Something that had been waiting for this very moment, waiting for humanity to learn the truth of what they were. The tension reached its breaking point, and the only certainty was this: the next move would not just determine survival. It would determine what humanity truly was, weapon or something greater. The fleet above Earth had been silent for too long. The alien armada, black and sharp against the void, seemed almost alive, waiting, calculating. Every sensor screen flickered with warnings, every human heart beat harder with the weight of knowing what was about to come. Humanity had spent generations running from these invaders, resisting in small ways, always on the edge of extinction. But now, with Earth exposed and cornered, there was no running left. In the underground chamber of the final command center, the team huddled together, their faces pale but steady. They had uncovered the truth at last. The so-called ancient weapon the enemy had hunted wasn't some machine buried under ruins or some piece of lost alien technology. It was humanity itself. The resilience, the will to fight even when hope seemed gone, the way people adapted, resisted, and found strength in the unthinkable. This was the weapon the universe had feared. And now the enemy finally understood it too. But they had miscalculated. They believed they could control it, twist it into submission, turn the human spirit into something useful for their empire. What they didn't understand was that this strength, once ignited, could not be contained. Humanity wasn't waiting to be used. Humanity was ready to strike. The first wave of the alien attack tore into the skies, the fleet unleashing fire so bright it turned night into burning daylight. Cities shook, oceans heaved, the world itself seemed to cry out. The command team didn't flinch. They were already executing the plan, one born from desperation but fueled by defiance. A message had been sent across every channel, across every settlement, every ship still wandering the dark. Stand. Fight. Now. And they answered. From hidden colonies on fractured moons, from battered freighters thought long abandoned, from crumbling bunkers on scorched worlds, humanity rose. Ships poured out of hiding, patched together with scrap, armed with weapons no sane fleet would call ready. But they came, every last one of them, because to not fight was to die. The aliens didn't expect it. They thought the battle would end in minutes, that crushing Earth would be nothing more than stamping out the last embers. Instead, they were met with fire from all directions, swarms of human ships diving at impossible angles, engines screaming, weapons blazing. The sky became chaos, a storm of metal and light where fragile human craft slammed head-on into ships 10 times their size, refusing to give ground. The command center shook violently as power surges coursed through the ancient systems. Sparks rained down, and the floor rumbled like the world itself might tear apart. But above the noise, the voices of the crew stayed firm, calling out coordinates, marking new enemy formations, rallying one another as if their words alone kept the fire alive. Then came the moment no one had expected. The alien flagship, the dark core of the enemy's fleet, moved closer, its weapons folding open like the jaws of some vast predator. One shot from it could shatter the surface of Earth, end everything in an instant. Fear cut through even the bravest of them. For a heartbeat, humanity stood at the very edge of nothing. And then the twist revealed itself. The flagship didn't fire. Instead, a signal broke through the chaos, an alien voice, not commanding, not threatening, but hesitating. For the first time the enemy wavered. The humans stared at their screens, hardly believing it. The weapon they had always feared, the unstoppable firepower of their flagship, was silent. And in that silence, a truth surfaced. Not all of them wanted this war. Some of them had been watching humanity fight, not with technology or numbers, but with something deeper, something no empire could replicate. And it shook them. A split erupted in the enemy fleet. Some ships broke formation, weapons turning against their own, chaos erupting not just between human and alien, but within the armada itself. What had been one unstoppable machine was suddenly tearing itself apart. Humanity, against all reason, had forced the enemy to fracture, to doubt, to fear. But the battle wasn't over. The flagship, though hesitating, still held enough power to destroy the planet with one strike if its commanders chose to act. In the command center, every human knew that this was the moment, the razor's edge between survival and extinction. The order went out to the remaining ships. All focus, all strength, all fire on the flagship. The final push was nothing short of madness. Human ships burned through their last reserves, diving through the enemy's fractured defenses, breaking themselves apart just to open tiny gaps in the shield. The flagship fought back, its guns unleashing devastation, scattering wreckage and flame. Still the humans pressed forward. In the chaos, one battered freighter, old and barely holding together, broke through. Its pilot knew there was no return, but that didn't matter anymore. The freighter crashed straight into the flagship's core, detonating everything it carried. For a blinding moment, the void was torn apart in a fireball so bright it erased shadow itself. Silence followed. The flagship, once a terror that had crushed worlds, split open and began to fall apart. One by one, the remaining alien ships faltered, some fleeing, some refusing to fire, the fleet dissolving into fragments. Humanity had not just survived, they had won. But just as relief threatened to break through, the unexpected twist came. Deep inside the wreckage of the flagship, before it finally tore itself apart, a final transmission pulsed through every human channel. The voice was alien, but the words were clear, translated with painful precision. This is not the end. You have become the weapon we feared. And every empire will come for you now. Asterisk. The words hit like a knife. Humanity had survived, yes. They had proven they were not prey but predators. Yet victory came with a truth even harder to bear. They had just revealed themselves to the entire galaxy. What was hidden was now exposed. What had been whispered as legend was now undeniable fact. Humanity was no longer just another species clinging to survival. They were the ultimate weapon. And the galaxy would never forget it. In the command center, the crew sat in silence, staring at the smoking skies outside, the weight of the moment pressing down. They had saved Earth, but in doing so, they had painted a target on all of humanity. The war was not over, it was only beginning. And yet, through exhaustion, through the grief of loss, through the wreckage of their world, one truth remained. They had stood together. They had fought back. And no matter what came next, they knew one thing for certain: humanity bows to no one. When the storm of battle finally broke and silence began to seep back into the shattered void, it was almost hard to believe it was over. For so long, the tension had been rising, pulling everyone tighter and tighter until it felt like something would snap. And in a way it had. The galaxy had seen the moment where humanity, cornered and underestimated, had risen to become the very weapon others had once searched for. Yet now, in the wake of the climax, what lingered was not just triumph but the heavy weight of what it all meant. The crew drifted among wreckage that was still glowing with heat, fragments of enemy ships that had once carried arrogance and certainty in their firepower. Now they were silent, broken monuments to a war they thought they would win without challenge. The humans had stood at the center of that storm, and they had not only endured it, they had changed its course entirely. That was the human strength. Not the sharpest claws, not the thickest armor, not the most advanced weapons, but the will to rise, to adapt, to never back down even when outnumbered and overmatched. Those who had fought side by side were exhausted. Their hands shook as they checked systems, their voices cracked as they reported in. Some were crying quietly, not from pain but from the sheer release of knowing they were alive after everything. Others just stared at the stars as though seeing them for the first time. It was in those fragile, unguarded moments that the truth of humanity's place in the galaxy became clear. They were not just another species fighting to survive. They were a mirror held up to all others, forcing them to confront what it meant to endure, to resist, to win without surrendering who they were. But the cost was not small. Among the debris floated reminders of those who hadn't made it, names that would never again answer when called. Humanity's strength had been proven, but it had been carved out of sacrifice. The survivors carried that weight, and with it came a promise that their fight was never just for survival but for a future that would mean something. That was what made humanity dangerous, what made them the ultimate weapon. They fought not only to live but to make life worth living. Whispers spread quickly. Across scattered fleets and fractured colonies, the story traveled, how the humans had turned the tide. Some called it impossible, others called it reckless, but no one could deny it anymore. The weapon they had all once feared was not forged in labs or buried in ancient ruins. It was alive, breathing, carrying scars and hope in equal measure. It was humanity itself. The allies who had doubted them now looked with something closer to awe. Fear was still there, fear of what humans could do when pushed too far, but it was no longer the same kind of fear. It was the kind that came with respect, with recognition that humanity had earned their place not by being stronger than anyone else, but by being unbreakable where others would have shattered. Among the crew, silence stretched until someone finally spoke, their voice small but steady. "We did it. We really did it." And just like that, the quiet broke. Laughter and tears mingled together. Hands clasped across consoles, shoulders leaned against each other, the weight of survival shared in unspoken bonds. For a brief, fragile moment, they allowed themselves to feel what victory truly meant. And yet, even in the warmth of relief, something darker lingered. The final unexpected twist had not been the destruction of their enemies, nor the revelation of what humanity was capable of. It was the realization that the galaxy would never be the same again. Humanity had shown their strength openly, and now every power, every empire, every lurking rival would see them differently. Some would want to ally with them, others would want to control them, and still others would prepare to destroy them before they grew even stronger. The humans understood this better than anyone. Victory was not an end, it was a beginning. What they had done would echo, and those echoes would shape everything that came next. But instead of fear there was resolve. They had faced annihilation once and survived. They would face what came next the same way, together. As the ship turned slowly toward home, carrying scars in its hull and in its people, there was no need for speeches. Everyone felt the same truth in their bones. Humanity had been tested, and in being tested they had become something greater. They had proven that the ultimate weapon was not built from steel or firepower. It was born from the will to rise again, no matter how many times they were struck down. And in the quiet that followed, with the stars stretching endlessly before them, the humans carried with them not just the memory of what they had done, but the certainty of what they could do again if they had to. They were no longer just survivors of a hidden war. They were a warning, a promise, and a story that would be told across the galaxy for generations. Humanity had become the weapon. But more than that, they had become the hope that no empire, no enemy, no darkness could ever completely silence. And as the ship disappeared into the horizon of stars, the future lay open, dangerous, uncertain, but theirs to claim. That was the final truth, the one that settled into every heart as they drifted back toward whatever came next. Humanity bows to no one. They had shown it in fire, they had proven it in sacrifice, and they would carry it forward into every battle yet to come. And in that quiet, as they remembered the ones they had lost and looked ahead to what still waited, a single thought united them all, steady and unshakable. Humanity was not the weapon because it could destroy. Humanity was the weapon because it could endure, because it could believe, because it could never be broken. That was the legacy left in the void, in the silence after the storm. That was what the galaxy would never forget.